Hi guys, in this video I'm going to talk about the concept of key squares. What are key squares? Key squares are squares in king versus king plus pawn endgame that if white king managed to reach it, assuming that white is the one with extra pawn, then white should win the game. We're going to divide this study into three cases. First is the center pawns. Center pawns mean pawns in C, D, E, and F file. And then the knight pawns, pawns in B and G files, and then the rook pawns, pawns in A and H file. The center pawns are the easiest cases. So for center pawns, the key squares are these three on the 6th rank. It's always on the 6th ranks, but obviously as the pawns move, as the position changes, then the position of the key squares change. Here the pawn is in C file, so the key squares are the one directly in front of it, and the one to the right, and the one to the left. Now let's say that the pawns are actually in F file, then the key squares will be E6, F6, and G6. And if the pawn is in E2, then the key squares will be this, this, and this. I think you get the idea. Okay, so now in this position in particular, it actually doesn't matter who is to move. White moves, white wins. Black moves, black will still lose. White still wins. The reason is that the key squares are these three, and the white king just need 2 tempo to reach one of them. So you can reach any one of them, and the black king is in no way, is in no position to stop the white king to reach that square. So let's just play this. Let's say black is to move, trying to come here basically to oppose the white king so that it cannot occupy one of the key squares, but it's too late. It reached the key squares again, one of these three, and it's totally winning. Push the pawn, do some opposition, and we promote easily. Okay, so the 6th rank key squares is very important, as we have seen. But I just want to emphasize something is, so even if black's king is in a position to control these key squares, it doesn't really mean that it's a draw, because white can use opposition to eventually occupy one of those key squares. So for example, let's say this is white to move, oppose the black king, and then black has to move either right to the left, and then now white occupy one of the key squares and it will win. So how do we tell, given any positions, on whether white is able to reach those key squares on the 6th rank? Here there is another rule of thumb. The rule of thumb is if the pawn is on the 2nd or 3rd or 4th rank, then we can extend the key squares to 2 ranks ahead of it. So 2nd, 3rd, or 4th rank. For example, the pawn is now on the 2nd rank. Then this B4, C4, and D4 are also key squares. The logic is that if the white king can occupy one of these squares, then it should be able to occupy the original key square that we talked about earlier. And if the pawn is on the 5th square, let me just clear some of the arrow. If the pawn is on the 5th square, 5th rank I should say, then the original key squares remain. So hopefully that's easy to remember. If it's 2nd, 3rd, or 4th, then it's 2 squares ahead of it. If it's on the 5th, it's just 1 square ahead of it, which is the original key squares. Easy to remember, just the 6th rank key squares. Just to give you an example on that rule, here we have a slightly different position. The pawn is now on E3, the 3rd rank. So this key squares, well, the original key squares remain, right? But remember, they are sort of like derivatives of the key squares, which is 2 ranks ahead of it. Here, white king is too slow to reach those key squares on the 5th rank, and so he won't be able to reach the key squares on the 6th rank. Again, if it's a little bit confusing, you can just forget about the key squares on the 5th rank actually. Those are just sort of like rule of thumb. The real litmus test is whether it can reach the key squares on the 6th rank for any position. But yeah, here let's demonstrate it, the concept of key squares. So again, the black king just need to prevent the white king to reaching these squares. And this is a draw. There's no way to proceed. Remove the pawn now. Same thing. There is no way to proceed. The key squares are occupied, and so white won't be able to promote. Now for the knight pawns which are on B or G files, the rules are exactly the same. The key squares remain on the sixth rank, on the opposite of it, one square to the right of it, and one square to the left of it. Exactly the same. The only difference, the only distinction that's worth discussing is there is a stalemate motive here if white is not careful. So here white should be totally winning, but let's see what happens if white is careless. So black king has nothing better to do but move back and forth. And here if white is careless, then it is a stalemate. It's a draw where white should have won. To prevent this kind of stalemate motive, there is one rule worth remembering, which is that for knight pawns, it's always better to let the king stay on the file that is closest to the edge of the board. So if the pawn is on the B file, then we want the king to stay on the A file. If the pawn is on the G file, then obviously that changed the direction. So we want the king to stay on the H file. Let's see that in practice. There will be no stalemate motive here. The king cannot make any more further progress, but it's already on the key square, so it doesn't matter. We just move the pawn in this case. When you cannot move your king anymore, you move the pawn. And now black has to give way. And no more stalemate motive, and it's easy win. So that's just one thing to remember. Now for rook pawns, it's much trickier to win with rook pawns because there are less key squares. So key squares for A file, for pawns in A file are these two. And if it's on the H file, then it's the mirror image of that, so it's these two. So if white king is able to reach one of these key squares, it will win. Otherwise, it's a draw. In this position, white to move, white wins because it can reach one of the key square. Let's play it. Reach one of the key squares, and now white wins easily. Now same position, if black is to move, it's a draw because the key squares are these two, and black would just be in time to prevent white from occupying those key squares. Remember, the key for black is to prevent white from occupying those key squares. The black king doesn't need to occupy the key squares itself, it just needs to prevent white from doing so. So again, to illustrate the concept here, black is in time to play king c8 and control these two. So white king can never reach this, and this is just a draw. Move back and forward. Yeah, white king cannot occupy one of these two squares, and there is really no way to proceed. Try moving the pawn. And now black easily get a stalemate. So to summarize, in king versus king plus pawn endgame, we need to remember the key squares and derivatives of the key squares. For side with the extra pawn, the king need to occupy these key squares. For defending side, the king need to prevent the other king to occupy these key squares. And for each of these cases, the summary is as follows. For center pawns, the key squares are on the 6th rank, but there are derivatives key squares, which is 2 ranks ahead for pawns below the 5th rank. For knight pawns, exactly same deal. However, you have to be careful. Remember the stalemate motive. For the rook pawns, the key square is on b7 or b8, and b8, I should say. For the pawns on the A file, and it's on G7 and G8 for pawns on the H file. Okay guys, that's all from me. Please leave feedback and comment, and if the content is helpful to you, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much. I'll see you in the next video.